Right, so in section 4, the Boatman Mountain Festival, I'm going to do a little bit of messing around with figures, only basic. But what we need to do is look at the difference between 2016 costs and 2017 expected. So remember, we've got actual costs, actual data, and expected. So if there's a question on why you or how you predict the cost for the future, well, you look at prior year's performance. How did they set up the festival last year when they had 10,000 visitors? Well, it cost them this amount of money. We might be able to get some revenue figures as well in the real exam to be able to look at whether they made a profit or not. Share price has gone up, so it does suggest that they have made a profit. So first thing we do, look at 2016, and we've got the venue, we've got the speakers, we've got the film element, the admin, and we've got the police. So if we're to then turn the 280,000 and using the percentages into actual figures, so we know what it's cost us, and then we can actually see whether in real terms things are costing us more in 2017 than they were in 2016, because remember, this is just a proportion, so 60% of that 280, but we need to know in real terms where the real rise has come from in terms of costs. We know that there's been a rise of, or will be a rise, total cost rise of 70,000 between there and there, but we want to know where it's hit hardest. So if we were to take venue first, so 10% of that, well, it's fairly straightforward, that is 28,000. Now if we go along to the speakers, that would be 25% would be 70 grand, and then we go to film, well that's 14, and then admin side of things, that would be 168, and then police, well there was no spending on police. Then the vital thing is comparing it to next year. So we look at venue, well that's changed, it's 10%, it's 9%, so as a percentage of the overall budget it's gone down, but remember 9% of 350 is going to be more than 10% of 280, so that takes us, that's that figure there. Then the next one along will be 94,500. This next one will be 20. So remember, so something like film, so we work out 7% of 350,000, well that's where we get that figure from. Go along and give these, and that goes up to 10,500. The important thing now is to work out the difference, and then we'll see where the greatest increase has happened in real terms in cash. So that has gone up 3,500. This one has gone up 24,50. This one 10,050. This, and obviously that's gone from nothing. So the biggest rise basically has what we can see is in the speaker. So that's where the costs have been incurred most. So as a management team, that's where they might want to start sort of renegotiating. If you weren't to turn those into real figures, then you'd think, right, well, the film has gone up 2%, and this has gone up 2%. However, that affects more here because it's gone up 24,500. So just be aware of actually overall they're the figures, and just be aware of how you work those out. So remember, for example, to work out what 54% of that is, so to get this figure here, all you would do is 350,000 times 0.45, so that's taken from there, and then when you get that answer, you times that by 100. Actually, no, you don't. Just leave it, and that will give us the sum. So that's we need to be aware of which costs have jumped. It might ask, and this cost potentially, policing has been introduced because of the drunk activity. So that's a cost that's increased. It's good that admin's gone down. The venue, maybe because they've stayed there for a few years, has gone down, but people are adding on costs. And we remember that we think interest rates might rise, so that could be brought in. So costs have risen, interest rates might go up. Well, how has that affected the ticket price? How has that affected demand? They're sort of a couple of big questions for the actual festival. Obviously, you need to try and keep your costs down, and you need to try and increase your revenue. It's fairly basic stuff. Your fixed costs, so things like your rent, etc., might be harder to change, whereas your variable costs might be easier to negotiate, might be easier to reduce than the fixed costs. Right, so in terms of questions, I think you should maybe look at, in real terms, where do Bowton Mountain Festival expect to see the biggest cost rise between 2016 and 2017? So we have discussed that. It's a fairly straightforward section, this one. The key will be, if we're given costs, are we then going to be given revenues? So there could be a potential for break even here as a question. Remember, break even is fixed costs divided by selling price minus variable costs per unit. We might be able to work out how many tickets we have to sell to break even. If that's the case, then we would be able to draw, and it would tell us there that's the break even amount, and then we would have to sell more tickets than that to actually go into that profit bit there, where total revenue is higher than total costs. Right, so that might be a potential there. It might talk about financial planning. So why would you actually look at the predicted cost for next year, and you would talk about planning, because that might mean you have to put some sources of finance in place, so loans, overdrafts. Does the 30,000 and the 50,000 and the sale of t-shirts and the sale of tickets cover all these costs, or are you going to have to go to the bank? If the festival is successful, then you're more likely to be able to go to the bank and secure some of these sources of finance, because the bank can look at 2016, 15, etc. and think, do you know what, they're good, they will pay these back, and so they will give you the source of finance. The term that they often use is, what collateral have you got to prove to the bank that you're a reliable person to lend to? So the collateral, if they were to own any assets, i.e. good things, maybe the land, maybe some parts of the festival, then they could put that up as collateral, and that would mean they would get the loan. If you don't have collateral, they have to look at prior performance data, 2016, 2015, etc., to give you that loan. Okay, right, fairly straightforward one, that one, I think. They might ask you to talk about which ones have decreased. So somehow they've managed to reduce their admin spend as a percentage. It's still gone up in real terms, but it's less. That might be because they've moved to use a more sort of technology-based booking system. Right, done. Let's load this one up.